Happy Monday, kings and queens. It is another beautiful week. We are jumping into Math 7, Unit 1, Lesson 9a. Today, once again, is Monday, October 26, 2020, and our classroom norms are that your cameras are to be on at this point, your mics are muted unless you are speaking or sharing out, and that you guys are ready to learn. Of course, today you will need your Math 7 Spiral notebook. We have a few notes to take, and we'll be taking notes on page 19. You will need a pencil, and you will need the student companion for today's lesson that can be found in Google Classroom. So we're going to kind of shift gears and start talking about probability and sampling. And more specifically, we're going to talk about chance experiments. Our standard for today is 7.sp.5, and our objectives are students will comprehend and use the terms impossible, unlikely, equally likely is not, likely, and certain in spoken and written language to describe the likelihood of an event. We're going to interpret percentages, fractions, and decimals that represent the likelihood of events. And we're going to order a given set of events from least likely to most likely and justify the reasoning. Our mathematical practices for today are MP3, MP5, and MP6. We're going to reason abstractly and quantitatively, construct viable arguments, and critique the reasoning of others, and attend to precision. So once again, let's make sure that we're ready to take notes and work with our classmates. We'll pause the video here so that you guys can copy down your standard and your objective. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next portion of our lesson. So for today, our goals are as follows. We want to be able to describe the likelihood of events using the words impossible, unlikely, equally likely is not, likely, or certain. We also want to be able to tell which event is more likely when the chances of different events are expressed as fractions, decimals, or percentages. So let's go to our engagement activity, which is titled, Which is More Likely? So we want to know in this engagement activity, which is more likely to happen. It says, when reaching into a dark closet and pulling out one shoe from a pile of 20 pairs of shoes, that you pull out a left shoe. And then when listening to a playlist, if you think about something on your phone or anything that you play music on, when listening to a playlist which has 5 songs on it in shuffle mode, the first song on the playlist plays first. So which one do you think is the most likely to happen? So we're going to begin by thinking on your own for 2 minutes, and we want you to be able to be prepared to share your thinking with the whole group. So we're going to pause here for 2 minutes, and I want you all to think, out of these two scenarios, which one of these is actually more likely to happen? All right, let's have two of you all share out what you think is most likely to happen, and then just explain why, and then we'll come back together to check our answers. All right, so thank you guys so much for sharing. Now let's talk about it. In comparison to these two scenarios, it is more likely that you will pull out a left shoe than the first song on the playlist will be the first song played in shuffle mode. So once again, it's more likely that you will pull out a left shoe. Remember, since the shoes come in pairs, you have a left one and a right one, it is equally likely that you would get a left or a right shoe. So half of the time you would expect to get a right shoe. Okay, half of the time you would expect to get a left shoe. So for the playlist, there are 5 different songs that could play first, and only one of them is the first song on the list. So you have a chance for the first situation for it to be half, whereas the second situation, it's only one option. So remember, the outcomes for the shoes or song scenario are not certain. It is possible to do both scenarios, but it isn't very likely. So How likely is it? So at this time, let's go to our exploration activity that can be found in your student companion. And remember, that is on Google Classroom. So let's take some time to open up your student companion that is found in Google Classroom. So let's talk about the categories of likelihood. And we're going to consider examples about opening 100-page book. And I want us to copy down these categories into our notes, specifically with this example, so that we have this as a reference when we move forward and also when we do other activities. So again, you're going to copy down on page 19 of your spiral notebook the categories of likelihood. And we're going to use the example about opening a 100-page book. So something is impossible if we're going to open the book to page 300. That will be considered impossible. Why? Because there's only 100 pages in the book. So of course we can't open to page 300. That category would be impossible. Something would be considered unlikely if we open the book exactly to page 45. Remember, there's 100 options. So opening the book exactly randomly to page 45 is unlikely. When we say something is equally likely as not, opening the book to a page number less than 51 is equally likely as opening a page that's greater than 51 because that would be half and half. Remember, there are 100 pages, so less than 51 would be 1 through 50 or 51 through 100. So that would be an example of equally likely as not. When it says opening the book to a page number greater than 10, that is likely because that gives you 90 options for pages. So that is something that would be likely to happen. And last but not least, something that is certain would be considered opening the book to a page numbered less than 1,000. And that is certain because all of the pages are numbered less than 1,000. So we will pause the video here once again so that you can copy down these different ideas of or categories of likelihood. Okay, moving right along. So now we're going to look at the exploration activity in our student companions. And for the exploration activity, it said that we wanted to label each event with one of these options, either impossible, unlikely, equally likely as not, likely, or certain. Remember, you do have the options in your notes now for you to make a reference to. So let's take about 6 minutes of work time and I want you guys to answer letters A through J, just thinking about whether or not these situations are impossible, unlikely, equally likely is not, likely, or certain. And you can type your answers next to the situation. Afterwards, we will come back together to discuss these as a whole. So we'll pause here so that you guys have some time to go over it individually and decide what the categories of likelihood are. Okay, let's come back together. So, were any of these scenarios listed difficult to categorize? If so, put the letter that was difficult in the chat at this time. We also want to talk about which categories are the most strict about what can go into them. What does it mean for an event to be certain? And what does it mean for an event to be likely? So, if you would like, let's have one or two students share out their thoughts around these questions. We'll pause for a brief minute so that you guys can share out your thoughts to these questions. And once again, in the chat, I want you guys to tell us were any of the scenarios listed difficult to categorize? Okay. Thank you all for sharing in the chat, and thank you guys for also sharing out. So let's go over our answers. For letter choice A, the scenario was unlikely. For letter choice B, the scenario was likely. For C, it was equally likely as not. So once again, we are checking our work in the student companion. So if you need to change any of your answers, let's make sure that we do. So A was unlikely, B was likely, C is equally likely as not, D is impossible, or if you put unlikely, that is also acceptable. For letter choice E, it could have been any of the options based on the characteristics of your class. For our first mod students, they tend to get on pretty readily and easily, but maybe for our fourth mod students, even though they have a lunchtime break, they're kind of slow to get on. So it really depends on your class makeup. So your answers could vary for letter choice E. Letter choice F is equally likely as not. Letter choice G is impossible, or you could have had unlikely depending on the location of our school. However, we know that in July it's not going to snow in Fort Washington. Letter choice H is going to be certain. I is going to be equally likely as not. And J is going to be impossible. Okay, let's move on to the next part of our lesson. So now we want to be able to share our own scenarios. So let's think of a scenario that would be considered impossible, unlikely, equally likely as not, likely, and certain. Now, for the sake of time, I want you guys to only choose one of them randomly. I want you guys to choose one of these categories randomly and come up with a scenario and write it down in your spiral notebooks. After we do that, I'll just ask about three of you guys to share what your scenario was, and then we'll move forward. So we'll pause here. I want you guys to choose one of these categories randomly and come up with a situation for that category. So we'll pause the video at this time for about 3 minutes so you guys have independent work time. All right, so let's take three students to go ahead and share out what were the situations that they came up with, and it could be for any of these categories. So we'll pause once again and share out for about 1 minute and 30 seconds, and then I'll give you what my responses were. All right, thank you so much. So, my responses were for something that is impossible, it will be finding a rectangle that has five different sides. Why did I choose that? Because, of course, a rectangle only has four sides, so it will be impossible for it to have five sides. Something that would be unlikely would be a peacock being born as an albino. That's just something that is unlikely to happen. Something for equally likely as not will be a coin flipping and it lands with the tailed side showing, and that's equally likely because it could be heads or tails 50-50. Something that is likely would be a box of crayons containing the color red. Remember, red is one of our primary colors, so it's likely that a box of crayons would have a red in it. And something that is certain would be a triangle has three sides because all triangles have three sides. So let's move to our elaboration activity, excuse me. Our elaboration activity is going to be our elaboration activity is going to be done just a little bit differently. We're going to revisit the game after we write down some things. So I want us to actually revisit the game tomorrow, and I'm going to have us in our notes actually write down some definitions. So Tomorrow, we're going to play a game of chance. And in the first round, player one is going to choose even numbers that will count as a win for them. And player two, if any of the odd numbers come up, they're going to roll the number cube. And then in round two, whoever lost the first round gets to choose 1 through 4 numbers that will count for a win for them, while their partner gets numbers 5 or 6, and we're going to roll the cube. But we're going to do this tomorrow because we're going to need a lot of time for this, well, more time than we have today. So, but I do want us to copy down these definitions into our notes because I promised that we did have a lot of things to write down. So the first thing is the chance experiment is something you can do over and over, and you don't know what is going to happen each time. And that's what a chance experiment is. It just means something that you can do over and over, an experiment, a game, or an activity, something you can do over and over, and you don't know what is going to happen each time. So, what I would like for you guys to do is to copy this part down in your notes. We'll pause here so that you guys can copy down chance experiment and its definition. Okay, let's move on to the next portion. The next portion is the definition for outcome. Now, an outcome is considered what are the outcomes for the chance experiment that we are conducting. So, an outcome of a chance experiment is one of the things that can happen when you actually do the experiment. So, if I'm flipping a coin, for instance, one of the outcomes could be that I get heads, or one of the outcomes could be that I get tails. If I roll a dice, one of the outcomes will be that it lands on the number 2 or lands on the number 3. So those are the outcomes of your chance experiment. So we'll pause here once again for you guys to go ahead and copy down this portion of the notes. All right, let's keep moving. So we're going to address these discussion questions when we actually go over the game tomorrow. But let's look at our word wall. So we have a chance experiment, which we talked about, an outcome. But one thing that we didn't talk about was an event. So I also want us to write down this definition. And an event is a set of one or more outcomes in a chance experiment. So it's a set of outcomes. For example, if we roll a number cube, there are 6 possible outcomes, and that would be the event. So let's pause here so we can write down the definition for an event. And once again, we've already talked about a chance experiment and its outcome. Okay, so our goals for today were that we wanted to be able to describe the likelihood of events using the words impossible, unlikely, equally likely as not, likely or certain, which we did. And then we wanted to be able to tell which event is more likely when the chances are of different events are expressed as fractions, decimals, or percentages. So according to, complete the evaluation task in your student companion. If you look in your student companion, it says here are some scenarios. According to market research, a business has a 75% chance of making money in the first 3 years. According to lab testing of a certain kind of experimental light bulb will work after 3 years. And according to experts, the likelihood of a car needing major repairs in the first 3 years is zero point 0.7. So the first thing that you guys are going to do is write the scenarios in orders of likelihood from least to greatest after 3 years. So which one is least likely to happen or most likely to happen? You're going to write them in order. And then you're going to name another chance experiment that has the same likelihood as one of the scenarios. So you're just going to come up with another situation that would also match what was given. So we'll pause here for about 3 minutes for you to complete the evaluation activity. All right. Thank you guys so much for that. At this time, I would greatly appreciate if you submit your student companion, even though we do not have it filled out for the elaboration portion, that's absolutely fine because we did do a lot of work around our exploration and the evaluation. So let's make sure that we're submitting our student companion and that you guys are having a great rest of your day. That is your only activity for today is to submit your student companion. So let's take the time in between classes, if you have not done so already, to submit it. And we will be back together again for another lesson tomorrow on Tuesday. Have a great rest of your day.